Welcome to Unit 2, Para, Organizing for Insight. This is the first of the three main pillars that we'll cover. The intention of this unit is to organize your existing notes and files with a cross-platform system that supports capture, organization, and retrieval of your ideas. We want to start with what you currently have to be sure that whatever you learn in this course integrates with what you're currently doing. This starts with probably the single most common question that I receive in this whole realm of knowledge management, which is, how do I organize Evernote or fill in whatever tool you happen to be using? It's a great question because you may have noticed that most of these programs don't really provide you any structure up front. You have to kind of come up with your own. But it's also a problematic question because it's pretty unclear what that word organize really means. Does it mean that it has a small number of categories, that it's visually pleasing, that it's easy to find what you're looking for? So I'd actually like to start by laying out what are the exact requirements that an organizing system has to fulfill. I believe there are 8 of them. The first is that it has to be universal. This system has to encompass any kind of information from any conceivable source. Second, it needs to be flexible because you can't predict what sorts of projects you're going to be involved in the future, and you don't want to be changing your system all the time. It has to be able to adapt and evolve with your changing work. Third, it needs to be simple. Organizing is by definition overhead work. It's necessary, but it doesn't directly add value. So this system needs to be very simple to maintain. Fourth, it needs to be actionable. In other words, it needs to separate the small amount of information or knowledge that is directly actionable for your current projects from all the vast knowledge that you may want to save for other purposes. Fifth, it needs to be cross-platform. Instead of sticking to just one program that does it all, we want to be able to work very seamlessly across different platforms and different apps. Sixth, it needs to be outcome-oriented. In other words, it needs to directly support and enable and accelerate the different outcomes and goals and objectives that we're committed to. Seventh, it needs to be modular. In other words, we need to be able to hide or reveal different parts of the system depending on our current needs in the moment. And eighth, it needs to be opportunistic in a good way. In other words, it needs to take advantage of the in-process day-to-day work that we're already performing instead of requiring a big weekly review or monthly review just to keep things organized. The method that I'll be teaching you that I believe fulfills all these requirements is called Para, which stands for Projects, Areas, Resources, and Archives. I've developed this method over the past few years, introducing it to hundreds of people in courses and workshops and in my coaching and consulting. I've seen it produce really fantastic outcomes across a huge range of industries and professions and use cases, and I'm very excited to share it with you today. Let's start with some definitions. I'm going to ask you to listen very closely here because this whole system depends on very, very precise definitions that may be different from definitions in common use. First is projects. A project, for our purposes, is a series of tasks linked to a goal with a deadline. So some common examples might be to complete an app mockup, or to develop a project plan, or to execute a business development campaign, or write a blog post, or finalize product specifications, or to attend a conference. Next is areas of responsibility. An area is a sphere of activity with a standard to be maintained over time. Examples of areas might include things like health, finances, professional development, travel, hobbies, friends, apartment, car, productivity, or direct reports. Notice that we're encompassing both work and your personal life here. This is truly an all-encompassing system. Third is resources. A resource is a topic or theme of ongoing interest. These might include things like habit formation, project management, coffee, music, gardening, or online marketing. And fourth, we have archives. This includes basically anything from the other 3 categories that is no longer active. So for example, a project that's been completed, or an area of responsibility that you're no longer committed to maintaining, or a resource that you're no longer interested in. Let's take a look at how these different categories connect with each other. In your day-to-day work, you have a range of different types of tasks that you perform. These tasks tend to fit naturally inside of projects. Those projects fall into areas of responsibility. For example, You might have a task called Write First Draft of Blog Post. That fits within a project called Product X Launch, which is within the sphere or area of responsibility called product development. Product development is only one of many spheres or areas that you might have in your work, such as financial reporting, hiring and staffing, or business strategy. In your personal life, of course, you have many other areas as well. Now, this is probably pretty straightforward, but let's take a closer look at the distinction between projects and areas, which tends to trip people up sometimes. An active project has two things. It has a goal to be achieved, something that will happen at a specific moment in time that will allow you to actually finish and check off this project from your list. Areas, on the other hand, don't have goals, they have standards to be maintained continuously over time. And areas don't have deadlines, they have indefinite end dates. Let me give you a few examples. Running a marathon is a project. Something will happen at a specific moment in time, the marathon, that will allow you to check it off your list. That project falls within a larger area of responsibility, which is health, which is a standard of performance that you have to maintain indefinitely. Publishing a book is a project. Writing is an area. Saving 3 months' worth of expenses is a project. Finances is an area. A vacation to Thailand is a project. Travel is an area. Planning an anniversary dinner is a project, whereas spouse is an area. So what's the big deal here? Why am I putting so much emphasis on this one distinction? I've actually come to believe over time that this distinction is at the root of many people's frustrations with managing projects and reaching goals. Let me show you why. I often get questions about productivity that fall in the category of capacity or utilization. Everything from how many projects should I have at any given time, or how much time should I spend on short-term projects versus long-term projects, or how should I split my time between using my capacity or building my capacity. These are fantastic questions and I love talking about them. But the truth is that you can't even really begin to have a discussion about capacity or utilization until you have a list of your current commitments. So the first thing I'll often ask someone, for example, in a productivity coaching engagement, is to show me their project list. And they tend to show me something that looks like this. The problem with this list is that not a single item on here is a project. They are all ongoing areas of responsibility. Just ask yourself, do vacations ever end for good? Is productivity something that you're ever finished with, that you can cross off your list? No. And this is a problem because I've found that there's 3 really crucial things that you cannot do until you break down this list of big areas into an actual project list. The first is that you can't truly know the extent of your commitments. Look at the item on the left. Does hiring/staffing give me any sense whatsoever about this person's workload? That could be anything from a few minutes a week all the way to a full-time job. Now look at the list of individual projects broken out on the right. Don't they give you a much better sense of how much this person has taken on, what their current workload is like? Breaking out this person's work into individual projects gives them a much better sense of how many balls they have in the air. The second thing you can't do unless you have a good project list is you can't connect your current efforts to your long-term goals. I often say that everyone's biggest bottleneck is just getting up in the morning. Personal motivation is the number one problem we always have to solve. Now, imagine waking up to the same list of responsibilities on the left, day after day, week after week, month after month. No matter how much effort you put in, how many hours, a list of areas of responsibility rarely, if ever, changes. They are ongoing standards. I couldn't design a better system to kill motivation if I tried. What we want instead is a list of very small projects that's constantly changing, giving you a sense of momentum and constant novelty. Even for something like, say, research on a new pharmaceutical drug that may take many years, it can still be broken down into experiment A, follow-up experiment B, and final experiment C. Remember that there is no inherent structure or unit of work. You get to use whatever definition for a project that you want. You might as well use one that provides a constant source of momentum and connects your current efforts to your long-term goals. And third, you can't know if you're making progress. Have you ever had an annual review for your job and you realize that you couldn't think of what you'd accomplished in the past year? This can be a little bit demoralizing and puts you in exactly the wrong mindset to walk into that meeting to ask for a raise or a promotion. What if instead you broke down a big area like events into the individual events that you had planned and executed? This way, at the end of the year, you'll have not only a list of all the projects that you completed, but all the associated notes and files ready to show for each one. Maybe now you can see why it's so problematic to confuse projects and areas. If you have a project, something that should finish in the near term, that you think is an area, for example, writing a book, it will tend to continue indefinitely. On the other hand, if you have an area, something that's an ongoing standard, that you think is a project, for example, you want to lose a certain number of pounds, even if you achieve it, you'll revert right back to where you started, because you didn't put in place any mechanism to keep it going. Achieving projects and maintaining areas require completely different ways of thinking, different approaches, different tools, and different methods. Projects require you to be laser focused, to ruthlessly drive toward an outcome, to smash through or circumvent obstacles, to ignore distractions. Areas, on the other hand, require mindfulness, balance, flow, and human connection. This is the realm of habits, routines, rituals, and intentional communities. There's a very illuminating exercise you can do once you take the time to formulate a project list. Put it side by side with your goal list, and then draw a line from each project to its corresponding goal. What you'll find is that some of them don't match up. But a project without a corresponding goal is called a hobby, whereas a goal without a corresponding project is called a dream. Now, there's absolutely no problem in having hobbies and dreams. They're what gives life meaning, but you definitely don't want to confuse them with projects and goals. The bottom line here is take the time to define your projects, or your projects will define you. Do this as a designated exercise that will give form and structure to all the different platforms and programs that you use. Now let me show you what that looks like. Even the simplest of projects typically uses multiple programs. For example, I might want to use my task manager to keep track of to-dos, a program like Evernote for notes, or services like Dropbox or Google Drive to share and collaborate on files. Once you've taken the time to formulate a very clear project list, you can then duplicate that list across every single program that you use, down to the punctuation, the capitalization, and the spelling. What this does is it creates the sensation as you switch back and forth between these programs that there's no mental switch required moving from one organizational scheme to a different one. You're using many different interfaces, but only one organizational scheme. Now let me show you what this looks like on my computer. You can see here in the Documents folder on my computer that I have the 4 categories: projects, areas, resources, and archives. I can reveal or hide each one at a time. Now, if you look at the projects and areas over in Evernote, they're the exact same ones that I have in Evernote as well. So I can hide them or reveal them depending on what I'm looking at. And even in Google Drive, where I have files and documents that I'm sharing and collaborating on with others, I have some of the same ones. You'll notice that I don't have all the same exact folders because I don't want to create folders that are empty just to create them. I only create them on demand as needed when I have something to store there. For the files in my Documents folder, this is actually what's called a symlink to my Dropbox folder, so every single file in all my different folders is synced to the cloud via Dropbox. There's a few final characteristics of Para that I'd like to point out. The first is that we use the number 4 as a useful constraint. There's lots of research indicating that the number 4 may be sort of the limit on working memory for humans. So this is why Para is only 4 categories wide: projects, areas, resources, and archives, and also no more than 4 levels deep. So using Evernote as an example, the levels would be the program itself, the stacks, the notebooks, and the individual notes. The second principle is that Para perfectly mirrors your task in project management. So sometimes I've seen knowledge management methods that try to have a completely different system for knowledge management than the one that you use day to day. This tends to break down over time because guess which one is going to get the priority? Para provides a way of organizing files that is completely in sync with your task and project management day to day. And third, Para preserves the most important distinction in productivity, which is between actionable and non-actionable information. Now, let me dive into this a little bit. With day-to-day work, you're probably only going to be in your task manager, which only includes tasks for active projects and areas of responsibility. But from time to time, for example, during a weekly review, you might want to expand your horizon to also take into account the information stored on different platforms such as Evernote, Dropbox, and Google Drive, or even in physical files. Even less frequently, for example, during a monthly review, you might want to consider your resources and your archives. This follows a well-known design technique called progressive disclosure. You only want to show the user as much or as little information as they need in the moment. What this is highlighting is that actionability is not really black or white. It's actually more of a gradient or a spectrum. The two categories on the left, projects and areas, are more actionable, and the ones on the right, resources and archives, are less actionable. What really sets Para apart from other organizational schemes is that it is a dynamic system, not a static one. Instead of producing value through very rigid, very strict categories, it's all about dynamic, ever-changing flows of information between the four categories. In the takeaway email for this unit, I'll send you a Para operations manual that describes these information flows in much more detail. The point here is that we want the dynamic nature of information to be an asset, not a risk to be managed. And this starts to touch upon just-in-time project management, which we'll cover in a future unit. You might be thinking, when exactly am I supposed to be performing all this work, categorizing and recategorizing information? I suggest that instead of performing this work according to a strict schedule, you do it opportunistically. And what I mean by that is just in the course of your daily work, as you notice, say, a note that could be useful in some other project, or a file that might be able to be used in the future, that you just make small improvements and small optimizations as you notice them over time. The thing with knowledge management is it's never done, and that means you don't have to worry about what done looks like. Instead of being perfectionistics and trying to perfectly categorize every single note, just think of it like a body of knowledge that you're slowly adding to in small little bits over time. And that's Unit 2. After watching this video and completing this week's exercise, you should have all your existing notes and files organized using this cross-platform system. Last thing is the action steps. Start by watching the videos for Units 1 and 2. Then, if you haven't already, complete the onboarding survey, which I will read in great detail and which will guide the rest of the course. Also do the personal knowledge management self-evaluation, which gives you a good before picture for you to compare with the after picture after the course is finished. Third, register for the online discussion forum and complete the Getting Started guide. I'll send you a link to do so after session 1. And fourth, formulate your project list using the instructions that I'll send you. I and others will give you in-depth feedback because it's not quite as easy as you may think.